Welcome to the Spiral of the Rose podcast with our friends Kelly and Bri.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Spiral of the Rose podcast. This will be our season wrap-up for season 1 of the podcast. And today we're going to be diving into talking a little bit about how when spouses, significant others, or other people in your life, when they're at a different point in their journey or have different beliefs than you in some way, how do you sort of handle that in your day-to-day life? And how do you approach that, especially when sometimes the beliefs can be vastly different or if conflicts occur? So we're going to dive into that and talk a little bit more about both of our experiences in that realm, how we've navigated through, and some tips for you as well.
Yeah. And I think especially coming up into the holidays where everybody's going to be visiting with family and, maybe coming across people who last year at the same time knew you as someone completely different. If you've been on a spiritual awakening path or anything like that, it can be a dramatic difference, right? So I think it's a really important time to just have something ready to go, right? Know how you're going to approach it because some people will react very differently. Sometimes even than we expect. And then sometimes there are those people who we know are not going to react well. So yeah, I'm super excited to dive in today.
Yeah, for sure. All of the above of what you've just said. So for me, I have really found, so this is one of the things that I've noticed, and especially in my relationship with my husband, but can also apply to those other family members that you're interfacing with on holidays that you might not always be interfacing with. So finding the points where you do align and focusing on those points instead of focusing on your big differences, right? Or how different you are or what you're not aligning on. So kind of like, even if you have to do a little brainstorming ahead of time, if you're going into a situation that you know you're going to probably have this come up and you want to be a little prepared. So maybe just start to think, okay, so what points, what are we the same on? What have we shared in the past that we both align on, that we both kind of believe in, that we can kind of talk about, so we're not going to have like focus on those topics that we don't align on, because sometimes that can just become messy and you don't want that whole like messy conversation to kind of come up through your holiday celebrations, right? So I'm not saying that like to never talk about clashing opinions, because of course there's always going to be like differences of opinions, especially in bigger families or whatnot, or friends groups. But if we could just focus on like what we're aligning on, and I think that really also contributes to that overall unity that we talk about on this podcast. We want to find what the unity between everybody, right? We don't want to divide further. We want to see where can we come to that balance and that unity? What do we have in common and how can we work with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like what you just said, focusing on the things that do align, it just reminded me of, when you're trying to consciously manifest your life, right? So not just necessarily like, oh, I want to manifest a certain amount of money or like a specific manifestation, but when you're trying to co-create your life and you're trying to be conscious and intentional about that, one of the things that we all learn when we're on that journey is to focus on what you want, because where your focus goes, the energy flows, right? This is like one of the famous quotes. So same goes in your relationships, that you're not focusing on the negative pieces. You're not focusing on the parts where you maybe disagree. You're helping to grow the parts that are positive and that you are aligned for, so that you can continue to have those relationships, right? And it can be really hard because some people are not as conscious as that. Some people are not as intentional as that. And it can feel really one-sided. However, we love our families. We love our friends. We don't want to be breaking all the bonds just to stand up for ourselves all the time and all of that. While of course, I am not ever going to say to hide your true feelings, but at the same time, like, we can just shift focus. We don't have to lie about them or pretend that they don't exist, but we can just focus on something else. And I think that's a really, that's a nice, like, a little bit easier way where we can be on the same page, right? Instead of having to force ourselves to come to some sort of a compromise, which is a great thing at some point. But when we're, it's holiday time, we've got a big family gathering or something like that, we don't want to be getting into fights and arguments and having people take sides and all of that drama. So I love that idea. And I think the biggest thing for me is, like, if I want them to accept me for how I am, I need to accept them for how they are. And so one of, it's not something that I originally came up with. I can't even remember who did, but the whole let them mentality for me is a really big thing, where it's like, I don't need to be right. I don't need to make them wrong. Right? It's just allowing people to be who they are and just let them do what they're going to do. Right? Let them have their own beliefs, let them feel how they're going to feel, and don't make them wrong or bad for that. And just, like, it's not about convincing them to believe the same thing that I believe. And I think that that's the biggest thing. Growing up, it was like the whole, there's one true church mentality, or there's one true set of beliefs, where actually, like, my personal belief is that there's truth in every belief, and that people, what they do believe is their truth. And so because we co-create our realities, what we believe is literally what we create into reality. And so, if I want other people to let me have my beliefs, then I need to let other people have their beliefs. And that's just how I've always looked at beliefs. Although I know that can be difficult when people are getting in your face, right? So, but I think that the more that we choose to let them, the more likely they are to choose to let us, right? And that's it's not necessarily like the perfect be all end all, but it's a good starting point for us to set the energy bar. We're not the ones starting it.
Yeah, I really love that. Yeah, I do. And what I was going to go into is kind of like it's kind of related to that. So it's a good transition point. But I find that when you are just unapologetically yourself and allow the other people to be unapologetically themselves, so kind of similar to what you were saying, you might be surprised at, first of all, you might be surprised at how things that you do align on. So I'll give an example, like, me coming out as like unapologetically me, as like my witchy self and all the things I love to do. And when I started like just sharing, like being open about it, or like leaving things around my house that people could see, it actually was surprising to me how a couple of family members really were kind of into it. So it was like, oh, I didn't realize, that my sister-in-law actually wants a tarot reading at the holiday. And like, I didn't realize all these things, like, because I had a preconceived notion of, okay, well, they grew up in the traditional religion, they don't want to do these things. But you'd be surprised at how open people are if you just share unapologetically about yourself. Sometimes they might be closed off to it, and that's okay. But other times you're just like, okay, I'm just going to put myself out there and see what happens and just go with the flow, right? And the other thing is that, when you are unapologetically yourself and you allow the other person to be unapologetically themselves. So like, for example, in a relationship is the biggest example I can think of, right? Me and my husband aren't perfectly, like, I wouldn't say not aligned, but he's not as into all the spiritual stuff as I am. He's more of this practical Virgo, like logical brain. so, pulling him more and more into my world has been kind of a slow process, but now that he sees this is me, right? This is who I am underneath all of the programming, underneath everything, underneath all of the masks that I put on in past years, right? They're all coming off now. And the more and more he sees that, I'm stepping up to that, and that's, it's not going away. He's sticking around. He's accepting that. He's accepting me for who I am. But that means I also have to do the same, right? I have to accept him. Who is he? Who is really he at his core, underneath the programming, underneath everything. And it is different than me. We're not the same person. And I wouldn't expect to be married to the same person as me, right?
That would
So
be kind
it's
of
just
weird sometimes, right?
yeah. So it's just like allowing that, that uniqueness and finding the points where you do align, which, as long as you're aligning in, for example, going back to the relationship, you're aligning in your major life, how to raise your kids, like, moving through life in relationships and like parenting and like, you know, all those different topics. If you're aligning on those, but you have slightly different beliefs in the spiritual realm or aren't on exactly in the same point of your spiritual awakening as each other, that's okay. And that's expected because we're all on a different journey, right?
Yeah. And I think I love the story of your family coming and being into it. I think that is so key. A lot of the time our preconceived notions, like we assume people are going to hate it or are going to be against it, but we don't actually know. And it doesn't matter what their background is, because look at what's our background and look how far we've come, right? So you just never know where they are on their path, and they may be too uncomfortable to say anything until they see you say something. And then it's like, oh, actually, me too, right? And they can get comfortable that way. So I really love that. And I think as long as sort of your main values and morals are aligned enough, you can get along with anyone, right? So as long as nobody's hurting anyone else and nobody's putting each other down and all of that, it can just be we agree to disagree, and it can be interesting, let's explore more, right? And like let's just see. And you never know too, like you may end up helping someone else to become more awakened and more aware of all the possibilities just by speaking your truth, right? So
absolutely. Yeah.
So I love that. And I think the biggest thing for me too is like, don't take any of it personally, because where somebody is on their path and what their beliefs are is going to have a huge impact on how they react to you. So they may not be a super judgmental person, but they may have it really pounded into their brain. The conditioning that they've experienced may be so against what it is that you now identify as. So like just the idea that comes to mind, like the example that comes to mind is I have family members who are like ultra, what's the word? Like, I don't want to say judgmental, but like they have preconceived notions because they've been told their entire lives, right, that witches are evil. So like, and we've had this conversation in past episodes where like, we talked about what our preconceived notions were before and then how far we've come. And really, so that's why I don't necessarily get upset that they have those preconceived notions. I try to remember it's not about me, right? But I've had them specifically be like, no, witches are bad, the end. Like they're not open for discussion. And I'm like, my best friend's a witch. Like, like in my head, there's that part of me, but then it's remembering that it's not about us. It's about what they believe and what they've been taught their entire lives. And if we can hold that space of like, not taking the reactions personally, but also not turning it into a joke, like to try to diffuse the situation. A lot of the time, I know for myself, like I turn to humor, but that doesn't help either, right? We don't want to turn everything into a joke and just make it like, oh, well, they actually weren't serious. Like, no, we want people to take us seriously. But I think when we hold that space for them to just be who they are, like you said, unapologetically themselves, and we love them anyways kind of thing, like, and this may be similar to like the turn the other cheek thing, but it's not about just allowing them to abuse you. It's about like, okay, well,
Yeah.
this is what I believe and I love you anyway. Like there's
Mhm.
no, it doesn't have to be a convincing kind of a thing. It doesn't have to be that one of you is right and one of you is wrong. And I think that when we hold that space and we allow that other person to be accepted for what they believe, even though we've made it so clear that we believe something different, I think that's the first step in creating that unity. Like you said, it's
Mhm.
if they see that you can do that, that is the first step towards them doing that. And it may take them a while. It may not happen immediately, but if they see that you're not being triggered, you're not reacting, you're not fighting back, you're not
Yeah.
telling them that they're wrong and you're right, they may eventually come around to realize, okay, we can coexist peacefully. And they may never come to the point where they agree with you or they feel the same way that you do or have the same beliefs, but at least there's that peaceful aspect to it. And it's not, again, it's not about keeping the peace by pretending, like again, with turning it into a joke or by pretending that, oh, like I didn't really mean that or anything like that. But it's just about, I love you anyway. And like, this is what I believe and I stand by that. But I can respect that you believe differently. And I think that that's, it's not easy to do, but I think that it's really important.
Yeah, I love that. And while you were talking, I actually had a good example come to mind of what you were just talking about. So on Thanksgiving, what was it, like a couple weeks ago? And I can't even remember times right now. It's so like weird to think of like timing, but Thanksgiving in the United States, right? I went by my parents' house for dinner, and typically, at family dinner, somebody will traditionally do a prayer, like a traditional prayer, praying to God as the one God, right? The one male God and everything. And a couple of years ago, it would have triggered the hell out of me. Like I would have been like, I'm not doing this, like blah, blah, blah. But sitting there this time, I just accepted it. I allowed it. I allowed it to happen. But then I spoke up and I activated my voice, right? And what I wanted to do, and which I told my mom ahead of time, was that I was setting up a place at the table for all the ancestors, and that I was going to do that tradition, right, from my spiritual belief. And so I said that after the prayer ended, and I told everybody that's what I was doing, and they were all like, oh wow, that's really nice and everything. And I just felt that like acceptance of both sides, like I
That's
accepted their
amazing.
prayer and they accepted my sort of, I don't know what you would call it, like more of a shamanic or witchy or whatever tradition with the ancestors. And it was just very much, I could feel like the unity kind of accepting energy in that exchange, and that felt really different from the past
Yeah.
experiences I've had. So I thought that was really like, that's a good example of what you were explaining.
Absolutely it is. And like what a beautiful example. And really, I think that that's the kind of thing that will help people to start to accept the other parts of your beliefs. Because again, like you said, finding the things that you do align on. Well, you're all there for Thanksgiving dinner. And what is Thanksgiving actually about? It's about remembering those people who came before us and created peace. And it's
Yes.
about giving thanks for that. And all. So what a perfect example of like a tradition and a practice that you do in like within the purview of your beliefs that really aligns with actually what they're there for. And so they can see
Yeah.
like, oh, this is something different than I've ever done. Nothing about it is abrasive or like pushing me to believe something different than I believe. It's a respectful, beautiful, like whatever. And it just is, it's like the first foot in the door is what that feels like of
Yeah.
just like, oh, awareness, we can keep the peace, we can coexist. And I love that. And not to mention that like that is a beautiful tradition. And really, if you look, that can open up the door to a lot of conversations, a lot of discussion that can be really enlightening and mind opening and all of that for people who have not started to explore. it's like a safe entry point. Do you know what I mean? It's something where you can be like, well, there are traditions around the world of people who do this, like the Day of the Dead and, all of this kind of stuff where it's like honoring the ancestors. And in fact, almost every tradition, almost every group of people in the world has a similar thing in their history. And, a lot of, I will say, like a lot of Western society, I guess, has let that fall to the wayside and just become really self-absorbed and sort of just like present day and whatever, and forgotten about the ancestors, and forgotten about the elders, and thinking that they know everything. And I think it has a lot to do with things like the internet, just the accessibility of information. They're like, I don't need to listen to the stories. I don't need to, and everything is so fast paced. So it's like, I don't have time. But I think bringing back those things can be a really beautiful experience. And I think that people witnessing that is like, oh, right. Again, it's just that, like I hadn't thought of it. I hadn't, and it's really non-abrasive. So I love that you did that. Like what a beautiful example. So yeah, I think that it's really important just going into the holidays, like prepare yourself. There are going to be people who are going to be really, and maybe not in your family, maybe yes, right? But there are going to be people who are really on the offense about differing beliefs, who are going to be very like pushy about their own, or who are going to be offended by the fact that you believe something different or whatever. And when it comes to your spouse, for example, it's important, obviously, that you find your overlaps, you find those things. And there are people who it's maybe less important also. And maybe we just don't talk about our different beliefs on the, and we just choose to sort of sit that one out because there's no point in creating an issue, right? And I think it's beautiful when you can, but it's also, it's not, to me, it's not a requirement. People don't have to accept what I believe, right, in order to be near me, in order to, like, if they are insulting what I believe and they're in my face and they're pushy and they're, all of that kind of thing, that's a different story. And I will absolutely stand up for myself. But allowing them to just be themselves, and like you said, to be unapologetically themselves, means that they do not have to buy in to my beliefs. So yeah, so I think going into the holidays with that mindset of like, no matter what, I'm just going to accept people as they are. And I'm going to, ask in a demanding sense, but not in like a pushy sense of like, this is my boundary. I'm going to ask that they do the same, that they respect me for who I am. Right. And we don't have to get into arguments about that. We can walk away, we can, whatever, but it's planning that ahead, because I think it can be really confronting when something comes up that you didn't expect, right? Some topic comes up and you are in that situation and you're going, do I speak my truth? Please do. Like, speak your truth, speak it kindly, but speak it openly, right? And give people a chance to accept you, because you never know that you can't assume that they won't, right? I mean, if you know that they won't, if you've got like a member of your family who's, say, like really racist, sexist, like whatever, all of these things, and you sort of tolerate this person, maybe don't bring it up to them, right? Like be smart about that. But it's, I think it's just nice to be prepared. And also, I think a lot of the time we think people will judge us, but especially our family coming together over the holidays, I think the biggest thing that they want from us, for the most part, obviously there are exceptions to the rule, but I think the biggest thing that they want from us is they want to know about us. They want to know about our lives. In this day and age, we don't always connect enough. We don't always communicate enough with our loved ones. We don't always see them often enough and everything. So I think the biggest thing for most people is just going to be, they want to know what's really happening for you in your life, and where you're really at and what's important to you and all of that, because they care about you. So it's an opportunity to be accepted, instead of assuming that you won't be, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then I would also add, you will be surprised sometimes at how you'll come back again later at the next gathering or something, and you sparked something in someone and they started doing research and they're like, oh, hey, you know, when you mentioned that thing about blah, 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 about this shamanic thing or something, I actually looked into it and I'm interested in it now. And I'm like, I love when that stuff happens. Like,
Yeah.
you don't force your beliefs on somebody, but you just plant these little like sparks and
Yeah,
people will
and
take
it's
off
not
on their
even
own.
like,
Yeah.
and it's not even like planting it like you're trying to convince them, but it's just
Mm-mm.
being who you are, and it
Yeah.
happens to plant this seed, right? And then it can be so enjoyable to just be like, we're on the same page, you know, like we're um now I have one more person I can be close to about this and that I can talk to about this. Like I think that's so much fun. Um
Yeah.
and you know, and then there's like weird ones sometimes. I'll say that too, where like people's preconceived notions, they'll be like, oh, that's super cool, but because they have like a different notion about it, where you're like, oh no, that's not me. So like I have a cousin, for example, I was talking about, and he's like really open-minded, and you know, like he's an entrepreneur, he travels all over the world, he's really successful, all of this kind of thing, very open-minded. And I was like chatting with him about the shamanism stuff, and he was like, oh yeah, I've done a few like the like the where you take something to go on a journey, right? Like
Oh,
you
the
take
plant
the
medicine.
plant medicine journeys. And I was like, oh yeah, no, that's not what I do. Right? Like, but he was like all excited. Oh yeah, we do the same thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, no. Um, but also, you know, for when he did that, it wasn't like I was like putting him down
No, right.
or saying that it was like, no, that's not what I do, and therefore we can't connect on this topic. It's like, no, we both experienced shamanic journey, so we can
Yeah.
connect on that. And that's that, finding the points that you do align on, right? And he was completely wide open and accepting to what I was doing. And it was a total, and we hadn't seen each other for a few years. So it was like a
Yeah.
complete shift from who I had been the last time we'd seen each other, right? So
Yeah, right.
but it really can be fun to explore. It's just a way to get to know more about the people around you and the experiences that they've had. You never know what they may have come across in their lifetime also, right? So I
Yeah.
think it's really interesting just to have those conversations.
Yeah, definitely. That's so funny with the comment of I'm a totally different person now. Like that happens. I feel like that has happened a ton when I don't see family for a long time. Then they're like, "Oh, what are you up to now?" And it's like, "Oh, it's totally different now."
Yeah.
Just sit down, let me explain to you like
Yes.
what's happening.
Sit down. Yes, exactly. So yeah, so going into the holidays, just try to be really intentional with that. Try to be very patient with others. Remember that everyone's at a different point on their spiritual path, and um and personal development path. It doesn't even have to be a spiritual difference. It can be like, you know, I'm expanding my mind and they're not. Right? And it can be hard to get on the same page sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think just remembering again, like, let them be who they are, let them be
Yeah.
unapologetically themselves, and you do the same. And you know, if they want to expect that from you, then it needs to go the other way around, and you're
Yeah.
perfectly allowed to expect that from them. And hopefully when you go into it with that mindset, you know, obviously there are going to again be exceptions to the rule. There are going to be people who are just too abrasive, or who are too, you know, they get too up in arms about it or whatever. But hopefully this helps for anyone who's listening to go into the holidays with like a peaceful approach and open mind. And you know, that's the other thing too, is like, remember that just because they believe something different than you, they're not necessarily wrong either. And they may have something that they can say to you that might expand your mind. And it can really go both ways. So it's not just like, oh, I'm on my spiritual path and I'm doing all this personal development, so therefore I'm the more advanced person, the more like, you know, I have the more expanded mindset and all of this stuff, so you can only learn from me. No, we can always learn from each other. So go into it with that open-minded, ready to learn and ready to accept everyone just for who they are. And it will make a huge difference for most people. in these kinds of situations. So I hope that that helps everyone to have sort of this more enjoyable, more building connections instead of problems kind of a holiday.
Less stress.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully some of that is helpful. And as Kelly said, this is our season wrap up for our first season of the Spiral of the Rose podcast. We're going to take a break over the rest of December and January, and we're going to be back February 3rd. In 2025. That is sort of right when we start stepping into the spring energies. And for those who follow like the wheel of the year, it's right after Imbolc. And we haven't picked our topics yet or anything like that, but we're looking forward to being back after some rest so that we can be renewed and go into that sort of new spring energy for season 2.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a time right now that we encourage all of you to also do your introspection and your rest, like winter, especially if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. This isn't a time to run around like crazy doing actions despite what society throws at you during the holidays. This is a time to hibernate and to introspect and to dig deep into your intuition and make sure you're taking care of yourself and just doing those self practices so that when you do get to that spring awakening season, you're going to be refreshed, renewed, ready to hit the ground running on your goals, right? That's what I always like look at it as.
Yeah. And I will say, like, before I ever followed this kind of stuff, I was not prepared to slow down in this season. And it can be difficult to prepare to slow down, but just do your best. Like if you haven't prepared for it, if you haven't, set up your business, for example, to run sort of on autopilot for a couple of months while you go into hibernation mode, then it might be really hard to completely shut down, but maybe just scale it back a little bit, do what you can. Again, like she said, to rest, renew, let yourself, fill your cup as much as possible. Realize that by doing that, you are supercharging your efforts in the new year. And you are, instead of pushing through where then you sort of hit burnout at some of the peak times when you really should be higher in your energy. Instead, you get to just fill your cup now and then have it be that you have all this energy at the right times going forward. And really just trust that it's safe to do that it's okay to slow down for a couple of months. Like that is, and I know for me, coming from a very like structured and forced and corporate, right? That mindset of like, you don't ever stop. That was really difficult. So just give yourself that permission to slow down a little bit. If you can't go all the way, that's okay. Right. But the more that you can, the better. But even if it's just a little bit, it will still help.
Yeah, definitely. It's not about perfection. It's never about perfection. It's just as much as you can. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I know for myself also, I would get bored as all hell if I shut right down for 2 months. So I won't do that, and that's okay.
Right. And
but
I would say if they're like,
less.
Yeah. And if it's like inspired action where you're like, ooh, I just have this, like, I want to do this right now and I'm inspired and I'm fired up. Perfect. Like that's the place to be, right? It's just not about forced action, I would say.
Yeah. It's not just to act. It's not acting just to act. It's not making yourself work and making yourself show up 24/7 when you are not inspired, because that's not really going to get you anywhere and it's going to push you into burnout. So so really, I know I personally am looking forward to a break from this podcast, from my Heartbeats Harbor podcast, from
all your podcasts.
Not all of them, because Suspending Disbelief is an ongoing daily. So I will keep that one up. Although I very well may stockpile them and not schedule them and like do all of that part until later. Who knows what I get to. But I will record them and I will keep track. But I'm definitely looking forward to like just pressing pause on all of this kind of stuff. As much as I love doing it, it is a lot. So it's
Yeah.
exciting to slow down. And I really look forward to our next season. I'm so excited. I cannot believe we actually, like, here we are. We're at the end of season 1 after all of that time that it took us to get this podcast off the ground. It's just really exciting to be hitting sort of this milestone of we did it. We did an entire season, and now we're hitting pause. So yeah, really excited and happy holidays, everyone. Merry Christmas, happy Hanukkah, all the different occasions. Happy New Year. If you follow the Western calendar, and I'm looking forward to talking to everybody in season 2.
And happy Yule and winter solstice.
Thank you. I was like, what other ones am I missing? I think there's also is Ramadan over the holidays as well? I can't remember.
I think so, yeah.
So, and I'm not trying to be ignorant about that, just so I really can't remember all the different dates from all the different cultures, but whatever you celebrate over this season and over the next couple of months while we're away, we are wishing you the happiest, most joyful, and most peaceful holiday season possible. So
yep, we'll see you all or you'll listen to us all in 2025. Not see you, but listen.
All right, thank you everyone, and we'll talk to you next year.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like it and subscribe. And if you really loved it, we would love a 5-star review, which helps us reach more people with our message. Comment your thoughts on the episode below, or if you have any questions you'd like us to answer in a future episode. Talk to you next time.